Imagine, if you will, the city of Rome, the magnificent heart of a vast empire during the summer of AD 64. It was this sprawling metropolis, a chaotic and beautiful mix of grand marble temples and those tightly packed wooden apartment blocks known as insulae. On the night of July 18th, a tiny spark set off a catastrophe that would change the city forever. The Great Fire of Rome didn't begin in a palace or at some famous landmark, but interestingly, in a much humbler location. It started in the Circus Maximus, which was the enormous chariot racing stadium. The fire likely originated in the shops built into the stadium's outer timber arches, places that sold flammable goods like oils and textiles. It was, honestly, a disaster just waiting to happen in a city built so closely together. The conditions that night were, well, perfect for a firestorm. A strong wind was blowing through the city, fanning those small flames into an unstoppable inferno. The fire leapt from the shops of the Circus Maximus and quickly began to consume the surrounding neighborhoods. Rome's narrow, winding streets acted like funnels, pushing the heat and flames forward with terrifying speed. The city's firefighting brigade, the Vigiles, were brave. But their simple equipment, just buckets and pumps, was no match for a blaze of this scale. The fire spread relentlessly, moving through those densely populated areas where thousands of ordinary Romans lived. The impact on the people of Rome was immediate and devastating. Panic erupted as citizens fled their homes with whatever possessions they could carry. Families were separated in the chaos, their screams lost in the roar of this fire. The blaze raged for 6 long days and 7 nights before it was brought under control. But just as people thought the worst was over, it flared up again and burned for another 3 days. When the smoke finally cleared, the extent of the destruction was truly staggering. Out of Rome's 14 districts, 3 were completely wiped off the map, and 7 more were left as smoking, charred ruins. Countless homes, temples, and public buildings were gone forever. The fire left hundreds of thousands of people homeless. They had lost everything and were now refugees in their own city. They gathered in the few areas spared by the flames like the campus marshes. Many slept in public monuments and gardens, desperate for food, water and shelter. The beautiful, powerful city of Rome had been brought to its knees. The physical scars on the landscape were immense, but honestly the emotional and political scars would run even deeper. The question on everyone's lips was a simple but dangerous one. Who or what had caused this terrible disaster? The answer would shape the next chapter of Rome's history. At the time of the fire, the Emperor of Rome was a man named Nero. He was a complex and controversial figure, known for his artistic ambitions and his often cruel and unpredictable behavior. When the fire broke out, Nero wasn't even in Rome. He was staying at his villa in the coastal resort of Antium, about 35 miles away. Upon hearing the news, he rushed back to the capital to take charge of the situation. He immediately opened his private gardens and public buildings like the Pantheon to shelter the homeless. He also arranged for food supplies to be brought in from surrounding towns to prevent a famine, selling it at a reduced price to help the suffering population. Despite these seemingly responsible actions, rumors began to circulate about the emperor. The most famous story, which has echoed through history, is that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. This image of a callous ruler enjoying a musical performance while his city was destroyed is incredibly powerful. However, it's almost certainly not true. For one thing, the fiddle hadn't even been invented yet. If he did play an instrument, it would have been the lyre. More importantly, historians like Tacitus, who is one of our main sources, report that Nero was actively involved in the relief efforts. The tale of his indifference likely started as a rumor spread by his political enemies who wanted to damage his reputation. So why did people believe these terrible rumors? Well, it was partly because of Nero's existing reputation. He was already seen by many in the Senate and the upper classes as a disgraceful and self-indulgent ruler. He loved performing on stage as an actor and musician, which was considered scandalous for an emperor. He had also been responsible for the deaths of his own mother and his first wife. His actions had created a great deal of distrust, and people found it easy to believe the worst of him. The story of him singing about the fall of Troy as he watched the fire fit the public perception of a man obsessed with drama and detached from reality. Furthermore, Nero's plans for the city after the fire only added to the suspicion. After the debris was cleared, he began constructing a magnificent new palace for himself, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. This was no ordinary palace. It was a gigantic complex spread over a huge area of the land that the fire had conveniently cleared. It featured a colossal statue of himself, a man-made lake, and sprawling gardens. To many Romans, it looked like he was taking advantage of their tragedy to build his own personal paradise. They wondered if he had deliberately destroyed the old city just so he could rebuild it in his own grand vision. With public opinion turning against him, Nero knew he needed to find someone else to blame for the fire. He needed a scapegoat to redirect the anger of the Roman people. He found the perfect target in a small, misunderstood religious group known as the Christians. At this time, Christianity was a new and mysterious faith in Rome. Most Romans knew very little about it, and what they thought they knew was based on rumor and suspicion. They were accused of all sorts of strange practices, including atheism for not worshipping the Roman gods, cannibalism, a misunderstanding of the Eucharist, and just a general hatred of humanity. They were outsiders, which made them an easy group to vilify. Nero launched a brutal and systematic persecution of the Christians. The historian Tacitus describes the horrific punishments they endured. Some were dressed in animal skins and torn apart by dogs in the arena. Others were crucified. In a particularly gruesome spectacle, some Christians were covered in tar, tied to posts in Nero's gardens, and set on fire to be used as human torches to light up his evening parties. Nero offered these savage entertainments to the public to satisfy their desire for justice and revenge. By punishing the Christians so publicly, he hoped to convince everyone that the culprits had been found and that he was a strong leader protecting his people. But what do modern historians think about the cause of the fire? The consensus today is that Nero was almost certainly not responsible for starting it. The idea that he torched his own capital is seen as a smear campaign created by his enemies. It's also highly unlikely that the Christians started the fire. They had no motive to do so and were a small, powerless community. The most probable cause of the Great Fire of Rome was something far more mundane: an accident. In a city of 1 million people, with thousands of open cooking fires, oil lamps, and flammable materials stored in wooden buildings, a major fire was practically inevitable. The windy conditions simply turned a regular accident into a historic catastrophe. The evidence points away from a deliberate plot. The fire started in a part of the city far from where Nero planned to build his new palace, and it even damaged his existing palace on the Palatine Hill. It seems illogical that he would start a fire that destroyed his own property and threatened his political stability. The blame placed on him seems to be a classic case of political opportunism. His rivals used the disaster to paint him as a monster, and he in turn used it to persecute a minority group for his own political gain. The truth of the fire is less dramatic than the legends, but it reveals a great deal about the politics and prejudices of ancient Rome. In the aftermath of the fire, Nero did more than just build his Golden House. He also implemented a series of important urban planning reforms designed to make Rome safer. These new building regulations were honestly surprisingly modern and sensible. New streets were made wider and laid out on a grid plan. The height of buildings was restricted to prevent them from becoming too tall and unstable. A crucial new rule stated that buildings must have their own walls and not share common walls with their neighbors, which would help slow the spread of future fires. He also mandated that a certain portion of every new building had to be constructed from fire-resistant stone, like that from Gabi or Alba. These new rules dramatically changed the face of Rome. The old, chaotic city of narrow alleys and wooden tenements began to be replaced by a more orderly and robust city of stone and brick. Nero also ensured there was a better water supply available for firefighting efforts and offered financial incentives to property owners who rebuilt quickly and according to the new codes. While his motives were likely mixed, partly a genuine desire for public safety and partly a desire to create a grander capital, the long-term effect was a more resilient and less flammable Rome. The city that rose from the ashes was, in many ways, safer and more magnificent than the one that had burned. The story of the Great Fire of Rome offers us several important lessons. Firstly, it shows how quickly misinformation and rumor can take hold, especially in a time of crisis. The enduring image of Nero, fiddling while Rome burned, is a powerful reminder that history is often shaped by the most compelling stories, not necessarily the most accurate ones. This tale, created to demonize a ruler, has overshadowed his genuine relief efforts for nearly 2,000 years. It teaches us to be critical of the narratives we hear and to look for the evidence that lies behind the sensational headlines, both in history and in our own time. Finally, the event is a sobering lesson in how fear and uncertainty can lead to the persecution of minorities. The Christians were a convenient and vulnerable target for a desperate emperor. Their suffering highlights a dark pattern in human history where outsider groups are blamed for complex problems. The Great Fire of Rome was likely an accident, a product of urban life in the ancient world. But the human response to it, the political scheming, the search for scapegoats, and the brutal persecution was no accident. It was a deliberate choice, reminding us of the importance of justice, tolerance, and resisting the urge to blame others in times of trouble.